All right, fifth graders, put your listening ears on. Now, we have been reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for the last week, and we have been talking about a lot of different things like themes and plot, and what else have we talked about? Yeah, we talked about how characters have relationships with each other, symbolism a little bit. Today I want us to think about something a little bit different. We're going to try a different strategy today. I want us to think about journalists for a second, and how when you watch the news, if you think they have just one point of view. Do you think they have multiple things they have to think of before they report on the news? Yeah, they should, because to get the full story, they have to go to several different sides and put together what they've learned into a report, right? I want us to think about our book and what the section I'm going to read for you today in that way. I want us to think about how characters interact with each other and how that learning what both sides of characters are doing and how they interact with each other can give you a little bit of difference in the story and change what actually might be happening. Now, when we think about this, can you think of anything looking back on what we've read that has been a conflict between two different characters? The main one we've had so far that's good is Lucy and Edmund. Now, does anybody remember what Lucy and Edmund did? I seem to remember that Lucy went through the wardrobe and she was very excited to come back and tell her siblings, and they did not believe her, so the next time she went in, she brought Edmund with her, right? And what did Edmund do? Yep, he came back and he said that nothing happened. That it was all made up and that nothing happened. That was a major conflict, right? Because of what would have happened if Edmund had agreed with Lucy right away. Yeah, they might have gone into Narnia a little bit sooner. They could have been on more friendly terms when they went into Narnia. So a lot of different things that we just read about yesterday might not have happened. Now, I gave you some worksheets we're going to fill out after, but first we're going to read a little bit. I'm going to read to you, okay? We're going to start right from where we left off. Who wants to tell me what exactly happened right before we left off? Yep, Edmund had gone to the White Witch and allied himself with her. Now, do you think that's a conflict? I want you to think about that as we read. How if he had not been so argumentative and difficult with his siblings, if maybe that might have affected how he went about interacting with the White Witch, and how maybe that lack of conflict or that conflict he had with his siblings, Lucy, Peter, and Susan, might have changed that course of the story. Why don't you think about that for a little bit? Get that in your little brains, and I'm going to read to you from chapter 10, just right where we left off. Chapter 10, the spell begins to break. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves into coats, except Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham, and here's a pocket of tea, and there's sugar and some matches, and if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crock over there in the corner." "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "Packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, did you?" "But we haven't time," said Susan, buttoning up the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." She? Who do I think she is? Now, looking back on it, I would think that it's probably the White Witch, right? Yeah, because Susan seems really afraid right now. Very, very nervous and anxious about the White Witch coming and maybe stumbling upon them, right? Why do you think she's so afraid? Yeah, because she's learned from others that the White Witch is evil. And we know that the White Witch has Edmund is with her, and does Susan know if the White Witch has Edmund? Yes, she does. So that's probably another reason she's so scared. She may be here any minute. That's what I say, chimed in Mr. Beaver. Get along with you all, said his wife. Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for a quarter of an hour at least. But don't we want it as big of a start as we can possibly get, said Peter, if we're to reach the stone table before her? You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver, said Susan. She sounds a little bit irritated, doesn't she? As soon as she has looked in here and finds we're gone, she'll be off at top speed. That she will, said Mrs. Beaver. But we can't get there before her, whatever we do, for she'll be on a sled and we'll be walking. That's true, sleds are much faster than walking, aren't they? Then have we no hope, said Susan. Now don't you get fussing, there's a dear, said Mrs. Beaver. But just get a half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer. Of course, we've got a hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go a ways she won't expect us, and perhaps we'll get through. That's true enough, Mrs. Beaver, said her husband, but it's time we were out of this. And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver, said his wife. There, that's better. There's 5 loaves, and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, my dear, she said, looking at Lucy. Oh, do please come on, said Lucy. Wow, even Lucy's a little bit irritated, and she's been the kindest one of all of them, hasn't she? They must be really nervous about the White Witch. Well, I'm nearly ready now, said Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring. Yes, it is, said Mr. Beaver. A great deal too heavy. And you don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run, I suppose? I can't abide the thought of what that witch fiddling with it will do, said Mrs. Beaver. And breaking it or stealing it, as likely as not. Oh, please, please, please do hurry, said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. It'll delay her for a bit, he said. And they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped, and the moon had come out when they began their journey. They went in single file. First Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, and Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and onto the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path among the trees, right down by the river bank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either hand. Best keep down here as much as possible, he said. She'll have to keep to the top, for you couldn't bring a sled down here. It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at through a window from a comfortable armchair, and even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on walking and walking and walking, and as the sack she was carrying felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all, and she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with all its waterfalls of ice, and at the white masses of the treetops, and the great glaring moon and the countless stars, and could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver going pat, 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 pat through the snow in front of her, as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared, and the snow began to fall once more. And at last Lucy was so tired that she was almost asleep and walking at the same time, when suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the river bank to the right, and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then as she finally came awake, she found that Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a little hole in the bank, which was almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing. Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. "Wherever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. I hope you know what I mean by a voice sounding pale. Do you guys have any idea what that means? Yeah, tired, sick sounding. Yeah, if your voice comes out really breathy and just really tired, that's what they mean by describing a color with a voice. "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not of much of a place, but we must get a few hours of sleep." Now, he said it's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times. And we know that the White Witch has been in control for a long time, so that's another type of conflict, is what she's doing to the actual people of Narnia, right? That's a different kind of topic completely. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought. Just a hole in the ground, but dry and earthy. It was very small, so that when they all lay down, they were all a bundle of clothes together, and what with that and being warmed up by their long walk, they were actually rather snug. If only the floor of the cave had been a little bit smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in the dark a little flask, out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and splutter a little, and stung the throat, but it also made you feel deliciously warm after you swallowed it. And everyone went straight to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, though it really was hours and hours later, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff, and thinking how she would like a hot bath. Then she felt a long set of whiskers tickling her cheek, and saw the cold daylight coming in through the mouth of the cave, but immediately after she was very wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, listening to a sound which was a very sound they'd all been thinking of, and something imagining they heard during their walk last night. It was the sound of jingling bells. What do you think jingling bells mean? Could be a sled. Yep. Who do we know has a white sled? You think the witch might be coming for her? Yeah, that might happen. That might be happening. We better keep on reading to find out. I'm kind of anxious about this. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do? But it was really very sensible. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among the bushes and brambles without being seen, and he wanted above all things to see which way the witch's sled was coming from. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They all waited nearly 5 minutes. Then they heard something that frightened them very much. They heard voices. Oh, thought Lucy, he's been seen, she's caught him. Great was their surprise when a little later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling to them from just outside the cave. It's all right, he was shouting. Come out, Mrs. Beaver. Come out, sons and daughters of Adam. It's all right. It isn't her. Oh, that's a lot of relaxing. I'm glad that's not her. I was getting worried for a second there. This was bad grammar, of course, which we all know that, right? But this is how beavers talk when they are excited. I mean, in Narnia. In our world, they usually don't talk at all. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight, with earth all over them, looking very frosty and unbrushed and uncombed, and with sleep in their eyes. Come on, cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. Come and see, this is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is already crumbling. Wonder what he means by that. What do you mean, Mr. Beaver? Panted Peter as they scrambled up the steep banks of the valley together. Didn't I tell you, answered Mr. Beaver, that she made it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, just come and see. And then they were all at the top of this hill and did see. It was a sled, and it was reindeer with bells on their harnesses. But they were far bigger than the richest reindeer, and they were not white, but brown. And on the sled sat a person whom everyone knew the moment they set eyes on him. He was a huge man in a bright red robe, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside of it, and a great white beard that fell like a foamy waterfall over his chest. Everyone knew him because, though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and hear them talked about, even in our world, the world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you really see them in Narnia, it is rather different. Some pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look only jolly and funny. But now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it quite like that at all. He was so big, and so glad, and so very real, that they'd all become quite still. They felt very glad, but very solemn. So when he looked back here and he said it was never Christmas, he meant that Father Christmas had come. So that's pretty exciting, isn't it? Imagine all those years without Christmas. Wouldn't that just be horrible? I've come at last, said he. She has kept me out for a long time, but I have got in at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening.